Hi everybody, welcome. Welcome to Music Mountain. So we're ready to start. Thank you for coming. It's going to be fascinating. The theme of the season, Home and Belonging, brought us to this presentation. The Gordon String Quartet was always looking for discovery, fun. It's all the same thing. And would play often the music of living composers. And that's how they started playing the music of Hugo Kauder. And thank you. I have to thank the Kauder Society and Helen Kauder, who is right here, for introducing this composer to me, sending me a CD, because it really was fascinating. I mean, I was driving, turned on the CD, and I'm like, wait a minute. I think I've heard that. Oh, that's wonderful. The first quartet. And then the second is just like, oh, this is so beautiful. Maybe he got a Japanese girlfriend, because the rest, it sounds very much like the very beginning, like a folk song from Japan, Akatombo, which we heard 2 or 3 weekends ago here. Anyway, fascinating. I invite you all in to enjoy this new composer, new to me, new to many of us, today in the pre-concert talk, and then in the concert. We'll hear the entire string quartet number 2 during the concert. And so for the presentation, I think we are really privileged because we're going to have 3 people presenting. So first of all, Karl Warner will start, introduce us to Hugo Kauder, audio samples, etc. But then we go on to Normandy. Yeah, Normandy, as a student of Hugo Kauder, is a direct lineage there of mentor or teacher student. So prepare many questions. And also we have the granddaughter of Hugo Kauder, Helen Kauder, is here. So I think it's going to be great. So let's, without any further ado, let's invite Karl Warner to the stage.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Karl Warner, as Oscar said. I'm here on behalf of the Hugo Kauder Society as the manager of the organization, and I'm here to talk about Hugo Kauder with you all. It's probably the one composer on the program that you don't maybe not have heard of quite yet. You're going to hear a piece of music that he composed nearly 100 years ago, almost exactly. To understand it, you really don't need me or anyone else to talk about it beforehand. Kauder's music speaks for itself. It's inherently pleasurable and meant to be enjoyed. I'm confident that it will thoroughly charm you from the start and take you on a satisfying journey. But my hope is that this experience will be enhanced by just providing you with a little bit of information about who this person was and the larger forces that shaped the music that you're about to hear. Kauder was born into a Jewish family in Tobachow, Moravia, in the current Czech Republic. His father was the principal at a local German language primary school. At the age of 17, Kauder moved to Vienna, Austria, where he spent his next 33 years. This is what the streets of Vienna might have looked like when he arrived. Where just a few years earlier, one might have caught a glimpse of this figure out for a stroll. And this is what the streets of Vienna looked like just before he was forced to leave in late 1938. Kauder first moved to Vienna in 1905 for 2 semesters of engineering courses. He was also enrolled in the program the next year, but did not complete a degree. Instead, he was swept up into Vienna's rich musical life and history as a capital of classical music. Kauder's talents and interest in music were evident in his youth, and he was already a very capable violist. He was generally a quiet person and felt lonely at first in this new and exciting place. But in these early years, he soon formed very strong friendships with 2 young, like-minded musicians, Egon Lustgarten and Karl Warner. And seen here are just a few letters that Kauder saved from them. Most of these date from World War I period, and both Lustgarten and Warner served during World War I. Kauder dedicated his early string sextet to Karl Warner, which is a piece that we're working on, trying to get it restored and performed sometime, hopefully soon. Like Kauder, Lustgarten was originally enrolled at the technical college, but the 2 often skipped classes and spent most of their time studying and copying music scores and doing research at the nearby library of the Society of the Friends of Music. Here they had access to Guido Adler's Denkmäler der Tonkunst in Österreich, a historical edition of music from the Renaissance, Baroque, and Classical periods. The library also had recently acquired the estate of Johannes Brahms, which included Brahms' own extensive collection of autographed music manuscripts, of other composers. Kauder had an astonishing photographic memory, and he absorbed everything that he could. In the 1910s, Kauder was active as an orchestral and chamber musician in Vienna. He gained an understanding of orchestration and continued to study and hone his skills. As a composer, he was entirely self-taught and had no formal training in music beyond violin lessons as a child. He began to experience success as a composer through important public presentations of his own new works, mostly written in a post-romantic style inspired by Bruckner, Brahms, and Mahler. He formed friendships with important musicians and artists in Vienna and became a well-respected and knowledgeable teacher and writer on music and aesthetics. In August of 1922, Kauder traveled to Salzburg as a representative at the inaugural gathering of the International Society for Contemporary Music. He stands on the far right of this photo. I think he looks like a nervous director in front of his choir. A few feet away is his old friend and classmate, Egon Lustgarten. And by the end of the next decade, these other composers, like Lustgarten and Kauder, were forced out of Europe due to their ethnicity and or because their music was labeled as degenerate and banned by the Nazis. All of them spent time in the United States and either settled or relocated from here. Of this group, perhaps Hindemith and Webern are the most currently well-known. Both in different ways are associated with musical expressionism and also neoclassicism, which both influenced Kauder. Neoclassicism is defined, as you might know, as a movement back towards earlier precepts of order, balance, clarity, economy, and emotional restraint, which definitely describes Kauder's music, especially his late music. As is well documented, Webern, along with Berg and their teacher Arnold Schoenberg, explored atonality, and in the 1920s, each solidified their own 12-tone techniques involving the strict, non-hierarchical use of all 12 chromatic pitches within the octave. Their work was Kauder's mirror. In close proximity, he was able to look into it and liberate himself to create and proceed along his own path. Webern and Berg were friendly to Kauder and actually supportive of his work. And here's a photo from a family album of Kauder with two of his colleagues, who I think look a lot like the two gentlemen on the left here. Kauder's early period culminated with his first string quartet of 1921, and his first symphony, which was composed in 1920 and 21 and premiered in 1924 as part of David Joseph Bach's Vienna Festival of Music and Theater. Opening the program that evening was a prelude and double fugue by Karl Prohaska, followed by Alma Mahler's 3 songs with the orchestra. These are all premiere performances, world premieres of these pieces. Kauder met and befriended Alma Mahler before 1917 and was a regular guest at the famous salon gatherings at her apartment on Elisabethstrasse. He was probably enamored with her, as many others were, and he dedicated his first symphony to her, perhaps in reverence for her late husband's work, or as a way to impress her with his own musical talents. And you see a letter from Kauder to Alma Mahler that she saved, dated much later, 1959. The third piece on the program, also a world premiere, was Erich Korngold's Piano Concerto for the Left Hand Alone, which was written for and performed by Paul Wittgenstein, a famous pianist who lost his right arm during World War I. He also commissioned similar pieces from Karl Weigel, Paul Hindemith, Benjamin Britten, Sergei Prokofiev, and Maurice Ravel is probably the most well-known of the piano concertos he commissioned. Kauder's symphony was the headliner that evening. For unknown reasons, its original second movement wasn't included as part of the performance. Paul Amadeus Pisk wrote a review of that concert, presenting a contemporary account of how well the piece was received. And he mentions that the piece concluded with Kauder's symphony. Although it is the work of a young composer, it nonetheless speaks with us with the refined strength of a fully mature person. He makes note of the quality of the second movement in particular, which is actually the original third movement, and also the final movement, and makes mention of the audience's response was very overwhelmingly positive. And as it says, Kauder and the conductor, Leopold Reichwein, had to thank the audience, who took several ovations afterwards, and actually in between movements as well. In 1928, Karl Weigel and Anton Webern sat on a jury that awarded Kauder a prestigious City of Vienna Arts Prize. And here's the letter that he received, which was the direct result of the First Symphony's successful premiere. I'm very proud to say that our organization last fall was able to get this wonderful work finally premiered in the US, and it was given only its second, third, and fourth public performances ever. by Leon Botstein and the orchestra now, and here's the program from that event that happened last October and November. And just to give you a very, very small taste of the power that Kauder unleashed with his large orchestra, here's the dramatic opening of the symphony's first movement, just the first minute or so. They performed that piece twice at Bard College at the Fisher Center. That's where that recording was made. And then the following week did a thrilling performance at Carnegie Hall, which to us truly felt like a long overdue homecoming for Kauder in the city that he quietly resided in the last 32 years of his life. A significant personal event occurred also around this time. In 1923, Hugo married Egon Lustgarten's cousin, the art historian and linguist Helene Gutmann. Kauder wrote his second string quartet in 1924 as a gift for his new wife. So that should be in mind when you listen to the music. In November of 1926, their only child, Otto, was born. Otto grew up and thrived as an American citizen. He remained devoted to his father and became the primary caretaker of Hugo's legacy. Several generations, I should say, of countless friends and family members deserve credit for us being here today and the success of the symphony and all of our endeavors. But we specifically remember Otto as Hugo's most important champion. This is a portrait of Hugo Kauder in 1926. He sat for this photo in the studio of Anton Josef Turczka, as these other additional examples of Turczka's work show, it vividly captures the creative spirit of Vienna during the interwar period. He also made famous portraits of Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele, looking here very much like one of his own paintings, as well as very striking images of dancers, including Hilda Holger and Eleanor Tortoise. At least one other copy of Kauder's portrait survived. This is his own copy. And you can see it has slightly different inscription with different font on it, which I find interesting as it more closely matches Hilda Holger's portraits. And I also include these images to remind us that all of this creativity was just emerging out of Viennese secessionist art and design. If the music of the Second Viennese School, in my mind, represents the expressionist side of secessionist art, then I sort of hear Kauder's as representing its more organic and sensual side. And both are inspired by its geometric design and formal clarity. And my favorite part of Kauder's portrait are these Klimtian vines that emanating around his tilted head that Turczka drew in graphite onto the photo print itself. By the 1920s, Kauder was a fully mature artist at the height of his creative powers. Interestingly, his musical language and style underwent a rapid change at this time, and one defined and driven by a minimalist aesthetic. While others went further into abstraction and complexity, Kauder simplified and distilled his musical language greatly. His instrumentation becomes more lean and his textures even more transparent. The extended chromaticism of his post-romantic works fade as he reduced his pitch material and redefined the potential of ancient pentatonic and seven-note modal scale systems. These stylistic changes do reflect the trends of neoclassicism, as does Kauder's fondness for strict forms and fugue-like structures, which you'll see in a second, although he had been using these structures since his earliest work. But it's truly with the second string quartet that Kauder's true voice, mature voice, emerges. Its harmony is diatonic and triadic, but non-functional in the traditional sense. The melodic material is drawn from diatonic major-minor scales, but often Kauder outlines a more neutral pentatonic framework in his melodic writing, and purposely avoids expected brute notes or de-emphasizes them with subtle rhythmic displacement. Chromaticism is used, but more sparingly and with great effect throughout this work, and I'll talk a little bit more about it just in a few minutes. Kauder would continue to distill his style, and eventually he eschewed the use of bar lines altogether because he didn't like the way that they cut through his music and visually cut through his music and disrupted the overlapping downbeats of his woven contrapuntal lines. Kauder's first and fourth string quartets both conclude with fugues. A lot of his works do. But stylistically, comparing them, you can see the changes that took place during this period. They're very quite different from one another. Here's the exposition of the C minor fugue that concludes his first string quartet, again written in 1921. The musical language is tonal in C minor, but freely chromatic, and Kauder is already exploring tonal ambiguity. The subject of this fugue, unlike a more traditional one, does not clearly establish the home key of C minor, and instead elusively resides somewhere between C minor and F minor, with the uses of the pitches E natural instead of E flat, and D flat. Kauder seems to allude to both of these keys without outlining a C minor or an F minor chord. The second violin enters with the answer, which is the subject transposed up in exact perfect fifth, and finally the music settles somewhat into C minor, but moves on restlessly from there. The viola, which is Kauder's own instrument and represents symbolically his own voice, almost always leads the way in his fugues. Here's the Euclid Quartet, actually from their seminal 2007 recording of Kauder's first four string quartets, of which Oscar was speaking of earlier. Music, as you can hear, and it shows Kauder's effortless mastery of contrapuntal forms. It just sort of came out of him effortlessly, but very smooth and very intricate. To compare that, here's the fugue that closes his fourth string quartet, just written only about 6 years later. Almost no accidentals are used, only the basic pitches of pentatonic and diatonic scales are employed. The subject, again introduced first in the viola, is static and, by comparison, harmonically very flat. But rhythmic vitality takes over as the main focus. So here again is the Euclid Quartet. I encourage you to investigate further on your own and listen to these great works and these great movements. I've already talked about neoclassical trends of this time period. One characteristic of those trends is pan-diatonicism, which you might know about, and you're already hearing examples of that. It's really using minor, major modal scales as opposed to chromatic scales like Schoenberg was doing to achieve a sound of a diatonic key, but without the limits of functional harmony or emphasizing a single note as a tonic. Kauder refined and applied this thinking to his own limited pitch material, and he developed his own scale theory and published a treatise on his findings in 1932, which is pictured here. As his own notes reveal, Kauder was especially intrigued with inversion and symmetrical reflective properties of different types of scales. And one can see similar obsessions in Schoenberg's sketches and 12-tone row constructions. In the 1960s, Kauder wrote and published a counterpoint book, which is the reworking of his earlier treatise, which I have a copy here. In it, he writes about the importance of polarity in music, and I'll just read you a short passage. Polarity, the primordial moving force of the universe and the origin of life on Earth, has also generated the basic elements of music. For sound is movement, just as light and life are movement. Owing to these arithmetical relations, the scale is a measured movement. Its fundamental tone is the generator of this movement and its center of gravitation. This gravitation, we call tonality, is the moving force that produces the inner life of music, thus making music a likeness of the order and movement of the universe. According to its function as the center of gravity, the fundamental tone has to be placed in the center in order to give the scale its most perfect shape. So essentially, we think of scales as ascending, some form like that. He recognized that it's a closed system, which goes up from a fundamental tone up a fourth, back down a fourth below, and then back up, sort of like an S-like figure. And so that, again, is in line with his ideas about polarity and balance, you know, above and below is sort of a median point. The second movement of Kauder String Quartet is also conceived and constructed with imitative fugal writing. The subject is thematically linked to both the first movement, here it is, and the last movement that you just heard of the fourth quartet. The voices enter more freely, and the structure reflects Kauder's newer ideas about balance and polarity. Once all the voices have entered, the music reaches a climax. Kauder balances out and unwinds the material by inverting the original subject and its answers. The original rising three notes of the subject, A, B, D, very simple, up a whole step, then up a minor third, becomes an exact, go back a second, becomes an exact reflection. Instead of A, B, D, goes B, A, F sharp, very simple, down a whole step, then down a minor third. The inverted answers in the second violin and viola are sounded simultaneously in parallel fourths. It's also a trait of Hind in this music, this focus on fourths instead of thirds for harmony. The use of these more harmonic open intervals is a hallmark of Kauder's later style, which replaced his earlier use of thirds and triadic harmony, which you do still hear traces of in the second quartet. Although the subject is harmonically flat, like the last movement, as the voices overlap, very rich and radiant harmonic combinations arise out of the texture, which is what makes this one of my personal favorite movements of Kauder's. So the piece you're about to hear, the second quartet, you've just heard sort of bookends around that piece. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really the first one in which Kauder's true voice emerges. It's cast in 3 movements. The first movement has elements of traditional sonata form, with an exposition at the beginning and a recapitulation or return of this material at the end, with free development in the middle. The piece begins in a pastoral mood with a dialogue between the first 2 violins. They contentedly call out and answer to one another. echoing and expanding each other's motivic material. The key is G major, but in the melodic writing, other pitches in the key are emphasized. All four voices join in and closely intertwine in a freely imitative texture, which pushes forward the motivic ideas heard at the beginning. The key shifts to B minor as the music becomes more pensive and uncertain, and then builds and recedes in waves. The opening material is treated in inversion, as in the fourth quartet, leading to a wonderful but very brief fugal section on a related subject of eighth notes followed by rushing 16th notes. Once all four voices enter, their collective energy and movement is quickly slowed down as the first violin calls them back to the exposition's opening motivic ideas. Soon they are often running again with the 16th note figures, and the music moves towards a transition back to G major and a recapitulation of the first section. The pastoral mood and material from the opening returns, but subtle alterations suggest the characters in this story have been changed somewhat. The questions posed at the beginning are satisfyingly answered as the returning ideas are organically expanded further and allowed to peacefully resolve. The second movement, you see here at the end of the first, is a brief and scherzo-like interlude. Its primary melodic material is rustic and folk-like. A short consequent phrase in B minor is cast in changing asymmetrical meters and repeated, followed by an antecedent phrase suggesting D major, which is characterized, as you'll hear, by playful syncopated rhythms and repetition of this main idea descending sequentially by step. This music seems to burst at the seams with joy and exuberance. Kauder repeats this material throughout, altering the texture with different voices leading the way. The music is developed through imitation and rhythmic expansion, and different shades of light and dark are expressed through changes of key and tempo. This movement ends quietly and seems to evaporate into thin air with a rushing, rising figure. It's actually a figure that Kauder was fond of, and he ends many of his other movements in a similar manner, and I was reminded of the end of the first symphony, the first movement. You can see a similar figure that ends his first symphony, although on a much grander scale. The third and concluding movement, which I think picks up and runs with the themed variation pattern suggested in the second movement. The main theme is very noble and I think Haydn-esque in my mind. The variations that follow provide unexpected turns and changes in mood. Kauder playfully uses chromaticism and creatively employs sort of what I think of as Bartóky and Stravinsky synthetic scale combinations to create even more light and dark shading within this movement. Like the first and fourth quartets, the second quartet ends with an astonishing extended fugue, but this time the second violin is allowed to lead the way. Kauder's music is rarely programmatic, but this particular work and its unique forms were inspired by the love story between him and his wife, Helene. The first two movements for me seem to suggest unrealized potential, which is then unified and fully realized and expanded in the third movement. As already mentioned, the music is full of joy and exuberance mixed with some anxiety and uncertainty, and certainly those are common feelings often associated with a new relationship. At the age of 50, Kauder was forced to start his life over, and he made a home here in the United States. He relied on a small, loyal circle of fellow refugee musicians to create opportunities for himself, and this brings us to why we're here today. In 1945, Kauder was composer in residence at the Second Summer Music Institute at Black Mountain College. Some of his European musician friends joined him there, including, as you can see on the schedule, names like William Valkenier, French horn player, Emanuel Zetlin, violinist, and Erwin Bodke, a keyboard player. The Gordon String Quartet was also invited as guest members. By 1945, Kauder had composed 9 string quartets, as it says in his bio, but he went on to produce a total of 19. As part of this series of concerts, the Gordon Quartet gave the US premiere of Kauder's 4th string quartet, which you've heard parts of, and the world premiere of his 7th, which is newly written. Soon after, Kauder gave a report on this event in a letter to his friend, musicologist Sigmund Levery. I don't know if you can read, but I just wanted to highlight the part where he says, at any rate, my music has acquired some new friends, and above all, it was a great satisfaction and encouragement for those of my friends who had exposed themselves for my work amidst the enemy's camp. What he's talking about is the previous year, in 1944, Heinrich Jalowitz, who's a Schoenberg pupil, was also on the faculty at Black Mountain College, and they organized one of the first presentations of the Second Viennese School in America. It was very important in regards to that, but Kauder considered, it's one of those rare moments where he kind of lets his real opinions known about their work. But he does say the Gordons played magnificently. The finale of the fourth quartet had to be repeated. I enclose a program, etc., and it describes other works that were played there. I found a press release from Black Mountain College, and they note a local newspaper review, which says, conceivably the future could bring a sort of American Salzburg's festival to our mountains, centering about the best talent available in the musical world. So we're here today to celebrate and revisit this connection between Hugo Kauder and the Gordon String Quartet. Next, Art Society Board President Norman D. and former student, Kauder student will speak. And I hope you greatly enjoy today's concert. Thank you very much.